They called him the ghost of Seoul. Kang Junseok was a man who moved in the shadows but controlled the light, owning the judges, the police, and the very heartbeat of the city. To the world, he was an enigma of iron discipline, a man without a pulse, and certainly without a weakness. But at the most opulent charity gala in the Gangnam district, the elite were about to discover his only tether to humanity, his mother, Soo-yeon. As the room watched in a sickening silence, a wealthy socialite splashed a glass of red wine across the elderly woman's silver hair, forcing the confused, fragile mother to her knees to beg for forgiveness. And Junseok, he did the one thing no one expected. He said nothing. He didn't move. He simply watched from the shadows as the lamb was savaged by the wolf. He waited until a woman with no status and everything to lose, a black maid named Amara, did the unthinkable. She stepped between the predator and the prey. This is the story of how a woman the world ignored saved the mother of the man the world feared. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel smelled of rare orchids, vintage cognac, and a deep, underlying rot. It was a masquerade for Seoul's predators to dress in silk and pretend to be saints. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a fractured, golden light over 300 guests, all holding breath and champagne in equal measure. High above the floor, perched on the shadowed mezzanine like a gargoyle carved from obsidian, stood Kang Junseok. He didn't drink. He didn't smile. He adjusted the cuffs of his perfectly tailored black suit, his eyes scanning the crowd with the cold, predatory focus of a shark in shallow water. At 38, he was the architect of an empire, a man who demolished enemies with lethal efficiency. "Sir," his lead enforcer whispered into his earpiece, "your mother has wandered away from the table. She's disoriented again." Junseok's sharp jawline tightened, the only crack in his stone-cold mask. "Find her," he commanded, his voice a low vibration of suppressed violence. "Gently, before the vultures realize who she is." While the ghost of Seoul monitored his empire from the heights, Amara Akoy was just trying to survive the night. To the guests, she was invisible, part of the furniture in her classic black-and-white uniform. She was there to work a double shift, her feet aching in practical shoes, every one earned going toward a future the people in this room would never understand. She was clearing a tray of empty glasses when the sound of shattering glass and a cruel, high-pitched laugh cut through the classical music. She looked up to see a woman in a cream-colored luxury suit looming over a tiny, silver-haired figure. The elderly woman, Soo-yeon, was clutching her chest, wine dripping from her cheek like blood, her eyes wide and glassy with the terror of a lost child. The elite guests pulled back, not out of mercy, but to keep the stain off their gowns. Amara looked toward the balcony, sensing the presence of the man everyone whispered about, but the ghost remained silent. The socialite raised her hand to strike, but before the blow could land, a hand caught her wrist. Amara didn't have a gun. She didn't have a title. But as she stood upright, her palm open in a firm, resolute stop, she possessed the only thing the most powerful man in Seoul lacked at that moment: the courage to be human. In the shadows above, Junseok's observant eyes locked onto the maid, and for the first time in 20 years, the ghost felt his heartbeat. To step into the world of Kang Junseok was to step into a vacuum where warmth had been surgically removed. His penthouse atop the Lot World Tower was a temple of glass and shadow, overlooking a Seoul that looked like a motherboard of neon and steel. Here, the ghost of Seoul operated with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Junseok moved through his life with the economy of a scalpel. Every word was a transaction, every look a judgment. His empire was built on the foundation of absolute discipline, a place where a single misplaced file or a stuttered reply could end a career. To his subordinates, he wasn't a man so much as a force of nature, unmoved by the shifting tides of politics or the pleas of those he dismantled. He was the architect of a silent war, ruling from a desk of obsidian where he adjusted his cuffs and watched the city's light reflect off his sharp, unyielding jawline. Miles below the glass towers, in a cramped basement apartment in Itaewon, Amara Akoy lived in the friction of the real world. For her, time wasn't measured in market shares, but in the frantic ticking of 3 different alarm clocks. Her life was a grueling cycle of invisibility. By day, she scrubbed floors in high-rise offices where the executives never looked her in the eye. By afternoon, she ran deliveries through the rain-slicked hills of the city. And by night, she donned the starched black-and-white uniform of a service agency for the elite. Amara was an outsider in a city that valued homogeneity, her dark skin and athletic frame marking her as a stranger even after years of calling Seoul home. Her hands were calloused from labor, and her eyes were tired from an exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix, yet they burned with a fierce, quiet resolve. She was working for a future, for an education that would finally give her a voice in a world that treated her like background noise. She had learned to keep her head down and her spine straight, moving through the predators of the city with the grounded grace of someone who had nothing left to lose. As the night of the Shilla Hotel gala approached, Amara tightened her apron and checked her reflection in a cracked mirror, unaware that her world of survival was about to collide with Jun Seok's world of silk and stone. One was a man who had forgotten how to feel. The other was a woman who couldn't afford to. Both were trapped in their own versions of a cage, waiting for a single moment of chaos to break the silence. The Shilla Hotel ballroom was a dizzying kaleidoscope of spinning silk and clinking crystal, a place where the air itself felt heavy with the scent of ego and expensive oud. For Kang Soo-yeon, the grandeur was no longer a spectacle. It was a labyrinth. The music, a sharp staccato of violins, seemed to vibrate against her skin, blurring her vision until the faces of the guests became nothing more than pale, predatory masks. She wandered away from the safety of the VIP table, her small, trembling hand reaching out for something familiar in a world that had suddenly become foreign. In her confusion, she didn't see the woman in the cream-colored luxury suit. She only felt the slight, accidental jar of her shoulder against the socialite's arm. The silence that followed was more violent than a scream. The socialite, a woman whose features were sharpened by a lifetime of entitlement, looked down at her damp sleeve as if she had been touched by a plague. She didn't see a fragile grandmother. She saw a blemish on her perfection. With a low, guttural hiss of disdain, the woman raised her glass. The red wine didn't just spill. It arched through the air in a cruel, deliberate crimson fan. It splashed across Soo-yeon's face, soaking into the modest navy fabric of her dress and staining her silver-gray hair like a fresh wound. The elderly woman gasped, her glassy eyes widening in a shock so profound it stole her breath. She stood frozen, the dark liquid dripping from her temple onto her pearl necklace, a visceral mark of shame in a room full of onlookers who suddenly found their champagne flutes very interesting. "Do you have any idea what this suit costs, you senile hag?" The socialite spat, her voice cutting through the hushed room like a blade. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you. Get on your knees, clean it, now." Soo-yeon's lip trembled, her hand clutching her chest as she began to sink, her dignity collapsing under the weight of a cruelty she couldn't comprehend. High above on the mezzanine, the ghost of Seoul stood perfectly still. Jun Seok's hands remained relaxed at his sides, his face a mask of obsidian, watching the crimson stain on his mother's hair with a terrifying, unreadable focus. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He simply waited, letting the rot of the room reveal itself, while his mother, the only thing he loved, prepared to humble herself on the cold, polished marble. The air in the ballroom grew thin, the tension stretching until it threatened to snap, as the elite of Seoul waited to see how much blood a shadow could take before it finally moved. The descent of Kang Soo-yeon toward the floor was interrupted not by the ghost of Seoul, but by a blur of black and white. Before the elderly woman's knees could touch the cold marble, a pair of strong, calloused hands caught her shoulders. Amara Akoy stepped out of the shadows of the service line, her movement so fluid and decisive that it seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. With a gentle but firm strength, she guided the trembling mother back to her feet, placing herself squarely between the victim and the aggressor. The socialite recoiled as if she had been slapped, her face contorting with a mixture of shock and fury. "How dare you touch me?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You're a servant. Move aside before I have you thrown into the street." Amara didn't move. She stood with her spine as straight as a steel beam, her athletic frame grounded and immovable. She raised her hand, palm open, in a silent, absolute command to stop. The gesture was so authoritative that the socialite actually stumbled back a step, the empty wine glass rattling in her manicured fingers. "The only thing that belongs on the floor tonight is your pride," Amara said, her voice calm, low, and carrying a resonance that cut through the nervous whispers of the elite. She didn't shout. She spoke with the terrifying clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose. "This woman is someone's mother. She is someone's heart. And you, with all your money and your fine silk, are nothing more than a bully in a costume." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. To speak to a donor in such a manner was professional suicide, yet Amara looked into the socialite's eyes with a moral resolve that made the other woman look small. "You want someone to clean the floor," Amara continued, her dark eyes flashing with controlled fire. "Then look at the mess you've made of yourself. No amount of champagne can wash away the rot of a person who enjoys the tears of the elderly." High above, the mezzanine was silent. Junseok's grip on the marble railing tightened until his knuckles turned a ghostly white. He watched the maid, this outsider with no title and a worn uniform, do what he had been waiting for anyone, to do. She had broken the god of silence's own law of restraint. In that moment, the power in the room shifted. It no longer radiated from the billionaires or the politicians. It was centered on the woman in the apron who was shielding a broken mother. Amara stood her ground, a lone guardian in a den of wolves, unaware that the shark circling above had finally found a reason to descend. The heavy silence of the ballroom was punctured by the rhythmic, metallic click of polished leather against marble. Junseok was descending the grand staircase. He didn't rush. Each step was deliberate, a slow-motion collapse of the room's remaining oxygen. The socialite, who moments ago had been screaming at Amara, went pale, the air dying in her throat as the ghost of Seoul emerged from the shadows. The elite guests parted like a receding tide, their eyes fixed on the floor, terrified that even a stray glance might draw the Reaper's attention. Junseok ignored them all. He walked straight to the center of the floor, his presence casting a long, cold shadow over the scene. He stopped inches from Amara, his sharp jawline set, his eyes as unreadable as black glass. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath, expecting the maid to be crushed for her insolence. Instead, Junseok reached out. He didn't strike. He gently took his mother's trembling hand from Amara's shoulder, his touch surprisingly tender. "You," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of those listening. He finally turned his gaze to Amara. Up close, his intensity was a physical weight, but Amara did not flinch. She met his stare with the same quiet fire she had used against the socialite. "You have a gift for seeing what others choose to ignore," Junseok murmured, his eyes scanning her worn uniform and the resolute set of her shoulders. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a small, obsidian-black card embossed with a gold crane. He didn't hand it to her. He held it between two fingers, an invitation and a challenge. "The agency you work for pays you crumbs to be invisible," he continued, his tone devoid of warmth but heavy with a new kind of respect. "I am offering you a different path. You will be my mother's shadow, her shield. You will move into my estate, and in return, your education, your brother's future, everything you are struggling for will be settled tonight. No more floors to scrub, no more 3-job shifts, only loyalty." Amara looked at the card, then at the fragile woman leaning against the man the world called a monster. The socialite tried to speak, to protest, but Junseok silenced her with a single, sidelong glance that promised an immediate and total end to her social existence. "It is not a request, Amara Akoi," Junseok said, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "It is a contract written in the blood you just saved. Will you accept the ghost's hand?" Amara reached out, her fingers steady as she took the card. The god of silence gave a curt, imperceptible nod, and for the first time in his life, he didn't scan the room for threats. He simply led his mother away, leaving Amara standing in the center of the elite's ruins, the weight of the black card signaling the end of her life as a servant and the beginning of her reign as a guardian. The transition from the basement's damp walls to the soaring heights of Junseok's estate was more than a change in geography. It was an entry into a world where every luxury was a gilded layer of defense. As the heavy iron gates hissed shut behind the armored sedan, Amara felt the air change, growing thin and clinical. The manor was a jagged masterpiece of obsidian glass and reinforced concrete, perched atop a cliffside like a fortress guarding the mouth of Seoul. It was beautiful, but it was a beauty that lacked mercy. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the climate control and the rhythmic tread of men in black suits who moved through the corridors like ghosts. Amara clutched Soo-yeon's hand as they walked through the grand foyer. The elderly woman seemed smaller here, her modest navy dress a stark contrast to the vast, hollow elegance of the marble halls. Every corner was monitored by the unblinking red eyes of security cameras, and every window was thick enough to stop a high-velocity round. "This is your new home," a voice resonated. Jun Seok was standing at the top of a floating staircase, looking down at them with a gaze that remained a fortress in itself. He had shed his gala jacket, and in his white shirt, he looked less like a socialite and more like the general of a private army. Amara walked to the center of the room, her practical shoes sounding like gunshots on the polished stone. She looked at the monitors in the security alcove, displaying thermal heat maps of the perimeter. She realized then that the contract was not just a job, it was an enlistment. To be the ghost's shadow meant living within his crosshairs. The wealth that surrounded them, the rare art, the silk tapestries, the temperature-controlled gardens, wasn't meant for comfort. It was the bait, and they were now the most precious assets tucked deep inside the trap. "You said I would be her shield," Amara said, her voice steady despite the weight of the surveillance. Jun Seok descended the stairs slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "In this house, there are no accidents. My enemies will look for a crack in my armor and they will find you. You are no longer a girl who is ignored by the world, Amara. You are the only part of me that is human. That makes you the most protected woman in this country and the most targeted." He paused, standing close enough for Amara to feel the cold aura of his authority. "Sleep with one eye open. My guards protect the walls, but you protect the soul." As the sun set, casting long, bloody shadows across the glass floors, Amara looked at Soo-yeon, who was tracing the patterns on a silk cushion with a confused smile. The glass manor was a masterpiece of safety, yet as the security locks engaged with a heavy, final thud, Amara realized the truth. They weren't just guests in a palace. They were the center of a war that had only just begun. The clinical perfection of the glass manor usually felt like an airtight seal, but tonight, a crack had formed in the silence. It was 3 a.m. when Amara found Jun Seok. She had been checking on Soo-yeon, whose sleep was often haunted by the ghosts of a past she couldn't quite grasp, when she noticed the faint glow of a lamp in the sunroom. She stopped in the doorway, her breath catching. The ghost of Seoul was not sitting at his obsidian desk or reviewing thermal maps. He was huddled on a low stool beside his mother's armchair, surrounded by piles of old, yellowed photographs that looked like fallen leaves against the cold marble floor. In his hand was a small wooden music box that played a fractured, tinny melody, a tune that Soo-yeon had hummed earlier that day before forgetting the lyrics and weeping in frustration. Jun Seok's shoulders, usually a fortress of tension, were slumped. The light caught a single, glistening trail on his cheek, a sight so impossible it felt like witnessing a star collapse. He didn't look up when Amara entered. He looked at a photo of a young woman holding a toddler on a sun-drenched beach, a version of his mother that was being erased day by day, hour by hour. "She asked me who I was tonight," he whispered, his voice no longer a low rasp of authority but a broken thread of a boy's grief. "I own half this city. I can buy the silence of a prime minister, but I cannot buy 1 minute of her memory back from the dark." Amara didn't pull back. She didn't offer the hollow platitudes of the elite. Instead, she sat on the floor beside him, her presence a quiet, grounding heat in the sterile room. She reached out and gathered the scattered photos, smoothing the edges of a memory. "You think your power is in holding on," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, the black glass of his gaze was transparent, revealing a hollow ache. "But mercy isn't just for the people you spare, Jun Seok, it's for yourself. She doesn't need you to be the ghost. She needs you to be the boy in the picture, even if she only remembers him for a second." She placed her hand near his, not touching, but offering a bridge. In that moment, the hierarchy of the manor vanished. There was no boss and no maid, no predator and no protector. There were only 2 souls navigating a world that demanded they be made of stone. Jun Seok looked at Amara, and the icy discipline that had defined his life flickered. He didn't pull away from her warmth. He leaned toward it, a silent acknowledgement that the woman he had hired to guard his mother was slowly, inevitably, becoming the guardian of his heart. The lesson in mercy had begun, and for the first time, the architect realized he wasn't the one in control. The stillness of the afternoon was deceptive, a polished veneer over a brewing rot. In the vast, high-tech kitchen of the glass manor, the air usually smelled of lemon zest and expensive roasts. But today, Amara caught a different scent, the faint, acrid sting of almond. It was a smell she knew from her chemistry textbooks, one that had no business being in a porcelain tea set intended for an elderly woman. She stood in the shadows of the pantry, watching as the head maid, a woman who had worked for the Kang family for a decade, tremblingly stirred a silver spoon into Soo-yeon's afternoon oolong. Beside her stood a man in a delivery uniform that didn't quite fit his muscular frame, his eyes darting toward the security cameras. "The Park Syndicate will have the wire transfer in your account by midnight," the man hissed, his voice a jagged edge in the quiet room. "The ghost will think it was a stroke, a natural end to a fatting mind. Just make sure she drinks the whole cup." Amara felt a cold flash of fury that burned hotter than the Seoul sun. These were the people Jun Seok paid to be his mother's secondary line of defense, and they were trading a life for a digital balance. As the maid lifted the tray, Amara stepped out, her reflection catching in the stainless steel surfaces like a blade. "That tea looks a bit heavy on the cyanide," Amara said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, low register. The maid jumped, the tray clattering against the marble island. The man in the uniform reached for his waistband, but Amara was faster. She didn't have the weapons of a Mafia enforcer, but she had the explosive speed of someone who had spent her life fighting for every inch of ground. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the rack, swinging it with a grounded, athletic force that sent the man sprawling before he could draw his suppressed pistol. The head maid began to wail, collapsing into a heap of terrified apologies, but Amara ignored her. She picked up the porcelain cup, the steam rising in a deceptive, fragrant plume. She walked toward the man groaning on the floor, her eyes devoid of the mercy she had shown Jun Seok the night before. "You think because I'm an outsider, I'm blind," Amara whispered, standing over him. "You think because I wear an apron, I don't know how to recognize a snake." She poured the poisoned tea slowly onto the floor, inches from his face. "The Parks didn't tell you the most important rule of this house. To get to the mother, you have to go through the shield, and I don't take bribes." By the time the security team arrived, alerted by the silent alarm Amara had triggered with her heel, she was already back at Soo-yeon's side, calmly wiping a smudge of dirt from the elderly woman's hand. The traitors were dragged into the basement shadows, and as Jun Seok entered the room, his eyes scanning the shattered porcelain and the bruised intruder, he found Amara's gaze. She didn't say a word, but the message was clear. The war had breached the walls, and she was the only one he could truly trust to hold the line. The storm that had been brewing in the shadows of Seoul finally broke with a violence that shattered the glass manor's clinical peace. It began not with a bang, but with a sudden, suffocating darkness. The power grid failed, and the unblinking red eyes of the security cameras died in unison. In the sudden vacuum of sound, the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots against the reinforced glass echoed like a heartbeat. The rival syndicate had arrived, and they hadn't come for a negotiation. They had come for the ghost's heart. Amara didn't wait for the backup generators to kick in. She moved through the pitch-black hallway with a sensory precision born of survival, her hand instantly finding Soo-yeon in the dark. The elderly woman began to whimper, the confusion of the night merging with the terrifying reality of the muffled gunfire erupting in the foyer below. "Close your eyes, Mother," Amara whispered, her voice a steady anchor in the rising chaos. "Count to 10. We are just playing a game of hide and seek." As the first flashbang grenade detonated downstairs, illuminating the obsidian walls in a haunting strobe of white light, Amara pressed her palm against a seamless mahogany panel behind a bookshelf. The mechanism groaned, revealing the narrow mouth of a secret passage. This was the maze Jun Seok had shown her in his moments of grim foresight, a series of concrete arteries designed for the day the fortress fell. They descended into the cold, damp throat of the mansion. Behind them, the sounds of the breach grew distant, replaced by the heavy metallic clanging of magnetic locks engaging. Amara moved with a grounded, athletic grace, navigating the turns of the tunnel while half-carrying Soo-yeon. She could hear the muffled shouts of the tactical team through the vents, men who thought they were hunting a frail old woman and a defenseless maid. They didn't know they were hunting a woman who had spent her life navigating the darkest corners of a city that didn't want her. When a stray intruder managed to find a secondary service entrance to the tunnel, Amara didn't flinch. As the man's flashlight cut through the gloom, she pulled Soo-yeon behind a concrete pillar and gripped a heavy brass fire extinguisher from the wall. When he rounded the corner, she didn't lead with a plea. She led with a strike so sudden and focused it left the man unconscious before his radio could crackle. She didn't stop to check his pulse. She kept moving, her focus narrowed to the trembling hand in hers. In the suffocating dark of the tunnels, the hierarchy of the world was gone. Junseok was fighting a war above, but down here, Amara was the only sovereign. She was the shield that would not break, leading the soul of the Kang family through the belly of the beast, proving that the Maid the world ignored was the only one capable of surviving its collapse. 6 months later, the grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel remained a temple of fractured golden light and expensive perfume, but the air within it had changed. The predators were still there, draped in their silk and diamonds, but they no longer moved with the same arrogant ease. A new legend had been written in the blood and glass of the manor breach, and tonight the city was waiting to see its authors. The music didn't stop when the doors opened, but the conversations did, dying away like a receding tide. Kang Junseok entered first, looking as dangerous and unyielding as a gargoyle carved from obsidian. But tonight, he did not walk toward the mezzanine shadows. He remained on the floor, his arm offered with a rare, public softness to the woman at his side. Amara Akoy did not look like the invisible girl who had once cleared empty flutes. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented the glow of her skin, her natural hair styled like a crown. Her spine was as straight as it had been when she faced down a socialite's wine glass, but now, her presence commanded a different kind of silence. Beside them, Soo-yeon walked with a renewed dignity, her hand resting safely on Amara's other arm. The confusion that had once clouded the elderly woman's eyes was held at bay by the unwavering presence of her guardian. As they reached the center of the room, the socialite who had once demanded Soo-yeon kneel found herself trapped in their path. She tried to offer a shallow, trembling smile, but Junseok's gaze pinned her to the spot, a look of such icy, predatory focus that her glass rattled against her saucer. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The city's elite realized then that the ghost of Seoul was no longer a solitary monster. He had found a foundation, a moral center that made his empire more impenetrable than any iron gate. Amara looked at the room, her dark eyes reflecting the sparkle of the chandeliers, but she didn't see the jewels or the titles. She saw a city that had finally been forced to acknowledge the humanity of the nobody who had saved its king. She wasn't a maid, and she wasn't just a partner. She was the architect of a new order. "Shall we dance, Mrs. Kang?" Junseok whispered, his voice a low vibration meant only for her. "I thought you didn't dance, Junseoka," she teased, her voice steady and warm. "For the queen, I make exceptions," he replied, leading her onto the floor. As they spun under the golden lights, the king and queen of Seoul became a united front of power and mercy. The man who owned the judges and the woman who owned his soul moved in a perfect, silent rhythm, proving that the greatest empire isn't built on fear, but on the courage of a single heart that refuses to look away.